Discover the power of female leadership in history. Are you ready to be inspired? Immerse yourself with us in the moving story of Deborah and Jael. Israel was living in a time of darkness. For 20 years, God's people had been subjugated by the cruel hand of Jabin, king of Canaan. The reign of Jabin, a ruthless tyrant, was maintained by Sisera, the commander of his army, whose reputation for violence and cruelty had spread throughout the land. With 900 iron chariots at his disposal, Sisera oppressed the Israelites, who, without a strong leader, had become easy prey for the Canaanites. The tribes of Israel, scattered and disorganized, lived in fear. Farmers did not dare to work their lands, and merchant caravans avoided the roads, fearing the marauding Canaanites. The people cried out to God for deliverance, but the answer seemed distant. However, in the midst of this scene of despair, a different figure appeared, a woman whose words brought hope. Deborah, the wife of Lapidoth, was not only a prophetess but also a judge in Israel. She sat beneath the palm tree that bore her name between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim. There, people came to hear her, seeking guidance and judgment. Deborah was known for her wisdom and discernment. Her authority came from God, and her presence was a beacon in the midst of the darkness that enveloped the nation. Although it was rare for a woman to hold such a position of leadership, Deborah was respected by all because her decisions were righteous and her prophecies were infallible. But the oppression of Jabin weighed heavily on Deborah's heart. She saw the suffering of her people and felt the weight of responsibility. She knew that God had allowed this oppression because of Israel's sins, but she also knew that divine mercy was not far off. The cry of the people had reached heaven, and Deborah was certain that the time of deliverance was near. One quiet morning, while meditating under her palm tree, Deborah felt a powerful presence, like a gentle breeze caressing her skin and bringing her a clear message. The Lord was speaking, and his words were for action, not just comfort. Deborah knew that it was time for Israel to rise up against their oppressors, but this battle would not be fought with swords and spears alone. It would be a battle of faith, where the hand of God would lead his people to victory. With her heart burning with conviction, Deborah decided that she would summon Barak, son of Abinoam, from Kadesh in Naphtali. He was a seasoned warrior, but also a man of faith, capable of leading the men of Israel in the fight against Sisera. Deborah knew that it would not be easy to convince him, for Barak knew the power of the enemy. However, she was certain that God had chosen this moment to deliver Israel. So, with the determination of someone who had received a divine mission, Deborah prepared to send the summons. The destiny of Israel was about to change, and a new page would be written in the history of the chosen people. Under the leadership of a courageous woman and with unshakable faith in the God of her ancestors, the people of Israel would walk towards freedom. The morning breeze carried with it the freshness of the new day, but there was a heaviness in the air that Deborah could not ignore. The message she had received the previous morning echoed in her mind. The call was clear: Israel must rise up and fight against their oppressors. There was no time to waste. Deborah, known for her serenity, now felt an unusual urgency. She needed to act quickly. In her heart, she knew that this mission would require not only courage but also absolute faith in the Lord. As her steps led her back to her tent, the prophetess was already formulating the words she would use to summon Barak. Upon arriving, Deborah summoned a trusted messenger. She dictated the message clearly and firmly, instructing the messenger to deliver it directly into Barak's hands without delay. He must come to her, for the word of the Lord had been spoken, and Israel needed its leader. As she awaited Barak's arrival, Deborah pondered the man to whom she would entrust leadership in the battle. Barak, son of Abinoam, was a respected man in his tribe. He possessed a rare combination of bravery and wisdom, and most importantly, his faith was solid. He had fought in battles before, but never against an enemy as formidable as Sisera and his 900 iron chariots. The sun had already reached the middle of the sky when Barak arrived. He entered Deborah's presence with a serious expression, knowing that a call from her was never taken lightly. Deborah stood up, her eyes full of determination, and spoke bluntly. "The Lord, the God of Israel, commands you, go and take 10,000 men from the tribes of Naphtali and Zebulun to Mount Tabor. There I will bring Sisera, the commander of Jabin's army, with his chariots and troops, to meet you at the Kishon River. I will deliver him into your hands." Barak listened intently, but the look of doubt did not go unnoticed by Deborah. He knew the strength of the enemy army and, even more, he knew that Sisera's iron chariots were virtually unbeatable in battle. After a moment of silence, he finally responded, but his words surprised Deborah. "If you will go with me, I will go, but if you will not go with me, I will not go." Deborah looked at him, sensing the fear hidden in his words. Barak, despite his strength and skill as a warrior, was hesitant to face such a powerful enemy without the assurance of Deborah's presence, whom he saw as a tangible manifestation of God's will. Without hesitation, Deborah answered firmly, "I will certainly go with you. However, the honor of victory will not be yours, for the Lord will deliver Sisera into the hands of a woman." There was a heavy silence between them after these words. Barak understood the gravity of what Deborah had said, but he accepted the condition. For him, the presence of the prophetess at his side was essential, and he was willing to share the glory of victory if it meant the certainty that God was with them. With the plan drawn up and the call accepted, Barak set out to gather the men of Naphtali and Zebulun. News of the call spread quickly, and soon thousands of men responded to the call, moved by the hope of deliverance and by confidence in the leadership of Barak and Deborah. Deborah, on the other hand, prepared for the battle in a different way. She knew that the real fight would be fought in the spirit, and so she spent the following days in prayer and meditation, seeking divine guidance for each step they would take. She trusted fully in God's promise, but she also knew that the battle would not be easy. The people of Israel waited anxiously, oppressed by years of slavery and fear. But now, under the leadership of a prophetess and a warrior, they saw a light at the end of the tunnel. Deborah's word was God's promise, and the people were ready to follow it to the end. Mount Tabor stood imposingly awaiting, the stage where Israel's fate would be decided. With a steadfast heart and unshakable faith, Deborah was ready to lead her people, knowing that no matter what happened, God's will would prevail. News of Barak's summons and the promise of deliverance under Deborah's leadership spread quickly throughout the hill country of Naphtali and Zebulun. Men who had lived in constant fear now gathered together, arming themselves with whatever they could find, swords, spears, and even farm tools converted into improvised weapons. For many, this was the first time they had ever held a weapon, but the hope of freedom gave them strength and courage. Deborah and Barak watched the encampment grow at the foot of Mount Tabor. Each new group of men that arrived was a sign that the people believed in God's promise, as conveyed by Deborah. Yet the task before them still seemed monumental. 10,000 men mustered to face a well-trained Canaanite army led by an experienced and ruthless commander seemed like a near-suicide mission. Deborah, with her usual calm, walked through the camp, talking to the men, encouraging them, and offering words of faith. Her presence was a constant reminder that God's hand was upon them. Despite being a woman, her authority was unquestionable, and even the most hardened warriors treated her with respect and reverence. While Deborah tended to the spiritual and emotional needs of the army, Barak was immersed in the logistics of the battle. He knew that, despite their disadvantage, the choice of terrain could be decisive. Mount Tabor offered an elevated position that would be difficult for Sisera's iron chariots to attack. However, Barak also knew that Sisera was no fool. He would surely have a strategy to overcome this disadvantage. The nights before battle were restless. Although the men tried to rest, the tension was palpable. Many spent their time sharpening their weapons, talking in whispers about their families and what the future might hold. Others prayed silently, asking for protection and victory. Deborah spent long hours in prayer, seeking God's guidance for the coming day. During one of these night watches, she had a vision. In it, she saw the Kishon River overflowing its banks, its raging waters sweeping away everything in its path. She saw Sisera's iron chariots stuck in the mud, helpless against the force of nature. Deborah knew at that moment that God was preparing something extraordinary, something that would ensure Israel's victory. With this certainty in her heart, Deborah gathered Barak and the other tribal leaders together. She shared the vision, instructing them to trust in God's plan. "The Lord will fight for us," she said, "and we just need to follow His lead." The next morning, the Israelite army was ready. Deborah and Barak gave their final instructions, reminding the men that they were fighting not only for their lives, but for the future of their families and the entire nation of Israel. The sound of drums began to echo throughout the camp, a call to war that resonated in the hearts of all. Barak led the men to Mount Tabor, where they took up positions overlooking the vast valley below. Deborah stood beside him, her presence bringing comfort and a strange sense of peace. Even with battle looming, there was a calm in knowing that they were doing God's will. From afar, they could see Sisera's army approaching, an endless line of soldiers and chariots. The glare of the sun reflected off the iron chariots, creating an intimidating sight. But Deborah and Barak did not waver. They knew that victory was in the Lord's hands. The army of Israel waited in silence, each man's heart racing but his mind focused on God's promise. The tension in the air was almost unbearable, but when Deborah finally gave the signal to advance, a wave of determination swept through the army. The men of Israel rushed down Mount Tabor like a torrent, shouting in unison, knowing that they were not alone in this battle. They knew that the hand of God was upon them, guiding every step, every sword stroke. The battle was about to begin, and the fate of Israel would be decided that day. With the leadership of Deborah and Barak, God's people were ready to face the enemy, confident that victory had already been decreed in heaven. The rising sun cast its first rays over the battlefield, illuminating the scene that would be the stage for one of the greatest battles in Israel's history. From the top of Mount Tabor, the men of Israel watched as the Canaanite army approached, a seemingly invincible force led by Sisera, the fearsome commander with his 900 iron chariots. Deborah's presence at Barak's side was a beacon of courage and faith. She looked at Sisera's vast army with eyes that saw not only the physical reality but also the divine plan that was about to unfold. Deborah's heart was steadfast, knowing that God's promise to deliver the enemy into Israel's hands would be fulfilled. As the Canaanites approached, Deborah raised her voice, clear and strong, cutting through the tense silence. "Arise, Barak, for this is the day the Lord has delivered Sisera into your hand. The Lord has gone out before you." Deborah's words echoed through the army of Israel, filling each man with renewed courage. Barak led the charge, charging down the mountain with his 10,000 men. It was a moment of pure faith, for from a worldly perspective, their chances of victory seemed slim. But the army of Israel advanced with the confidence of those who know that God is fighting for them. Sisera, on the other hand, looked at the mountain with disdain. To him, this would be just another massacre, like so many other battles he had won. His iron chariots were his greatest weapon, feared by all the peoples of the region. He gave orders for his men to prepare for the attack, certain that he would soon crush the Israelites. However, as Sisera's chariots advanced, something strange began to happen. The clouds, which until then had been scattered across the sky, began to gather, darkening the horizon. A strong wind suddenly blew, raising dust and causing the horses to scurry about. Then, without warning, the heavens opened in a torrential downpour. The waters of the Kishon River, which had begun the day as a calm stream, began to overflow rapidly. The torrents of rain turned the ground beneath the iron chariots to mud, causing the wheels to become stuck. What had once been an invincible war machine was now stuck, helpless against the forces of nature. Sisera watched in disbelief as his chariots became bogged down, his men struggling to maintain control but to no avail. Panic began to spread among the Canaanite soldiers, who had never faced such adversity. Meanwhile, the army of Israel descended upon them like a raging sea, seizing the advantage that had been given to them. The battle that followed was intense but swift. The men of Israel, spurred on by divine intervention, fought with a ferocity that astonished the Canaanites. Deborah and Barak led the attack with unshakable faith, knowing that victory had already been sealed by God. The iron chariots, which had once caused terror, were now useless. The Canaanites, who depended on their technological superiority, found themselves at a total disadvantage, with no way to maneuver or retreat. Sisera's army began to crumble, the soldiers fleeing in all directions, desperate to escape certain death. In the midst of the chaos, Sisera, realizing that the battle was lost, abandoned his chariot and fled on foot, desperately trying to save his life. He knew that if he were captured, he would be killed without mercy. His hopes of victory had turned to fear and despair. Upon realizing that Sisera was fleeing, Barak gave orders for pursuit. But Deborah, at his side, knew that Sisera's fate was already sealed, and it would not be at Barak's hands that he would meet his end. The battle raged on, but it was clear that victory belonged to Israel. The Canaanites were being crushed, their strength broken by the mighty hand of God. As the battle cries echoed through the valley, a new hope was born in the hearts of the Israelites. The oppression they had endured for so many years was finally coming to an end. Deborah watched the events unfold with a deep sense of gratitude. The Lord had been faithful to his promise, and Israel had triumphed. But she also knew that the story was not yet over. There was one final chapter to be written, and it involved the escape of Sisera and the woman who would be the instrument of his downfall. Sisera ran with his heart racing, each step a mixture of fear and despair. His heartbeat echoed in his ears as he ran away from the battlefield. Behind him, he could hear the sounds of defeat, the shouts of the Canaanite soldiers, the clang of weapons, and the roar of the approaching Israelite army, relentless. The commander, who had always trusted in his strength and invincible war machines, was now reduced to a desperate man, fleeing for his life on foot. His plans had collapsed, crushed not only by the strength of the men of Israel, but by the fury of the heavens, which had conspired against him. Sisera could hardly believe that in a matter of hours, his position of power and control had been destroyed. Sisera's mind was in turmoil as he ran. The shame of his defeat burned within him. He, who had been feared by so many, was now a fugitive, without honor or army. Each step took him further away from the safety of his king, Jabin, and into an uncertain future where his life hung by a thread. As he ran, Sisera spotted a small tent in the distance, isolated on the plain. Recognizing the place, his hope was rekindled. The tent belonged to Heber the Kenite, an ally of the Canaanites. Heber, though living among the Israelites, had maintained ties of peace with King Jabin, and Sisera knew he could find refuge there. As he approached the tent, Sisera slowed his pace, trying to catch his breath and appear in control. He needed to appear strong, even in his weakness, so as not to show the extent of his defeat. When he reached the entrance to the tent, he was met by Jael, Heber's wife. She recognized him immediately, though she concealed any reaction that might betray her true intentions. Jael, with a calm gaze and a welcoming smile, invited Sisera to enter. "Come in, my lord. Do not be afraid." Her words were like a balm to Sisera's troubled heart. He entered the tent, grateful for the hospitality, certain that he would be safe there. "Hide me," Sisera pleaded, his voice betraying weariness and desperation. Jael, maintaining the facade of hospitality, covered him with a blanket and offered him milk to quench his thirst. Sisera accepted the offer, feeling temporarily relieved. He ordered that if anyone came looking for him, Jael should say that there was no one in the tent. As he drank the milk, the weariness of battle and flight began to overcome Sisera. His eyes grew heavy, and he soon fell into a deep sleep, believing that he was finally safe. He could not imagine that the woman who had welcomed him with such sweetness and kindness was about to become his mortal enemy. Jael, with a heavy heart, knew what he had to do. She had heard of the battle, and knew that Sisera, Israel's oppressor, was at her mercy. While he slept, Jael picked up a tent peg and a hammer, driven by a mixture of duty and determination. She slowly approached Sisera, whose regular breathing indicated that he was fast asleep. With a swift, decisive movement, Jael positioned the tent peg at Sisera's temple and, with all her strength, drove it into his head, pinning him to the ground. The blow was fatal, and the mighty commander had no time to wake up to react. Sisera, who had sown terror into so many lives, met his end at the hands of a woman, as Deborah had prophesied. Jael stood silent for a moment, feeling the weight of her action. She knew that what she had done would change the course of Israel's history. Israel's victory lay not only on the battlefield, but also in the quiet of her tent, where justice had been served. Shortly thereafter, Barak arrived at Heber's tent in search of Sisera. Jael came out to meet him without a hint of hesitation. "Come, and I will show you the man you seek." She led him to the tent, where Sisera's body lay, lifeless. Barak, seeing the scene, realized that Deborah's prophecy had been fulfilled. The honor of victory would not be his, but that of a woman, Jael, who, with courage and determination, had changed the destiny of Israel. The news of Sisera's death spread quickly, and with it, the certainty that the oppression of the Canaanites was over. Deborah and Barak led the people in a victory celebration, recognizing that God had fought for Israel, using even the most unexpected means to accomplish His will. The news of Sisera's death at the hands of Jael spread quickly throughout the region. It was as if a heavy shadow had been lifted over Israel, and a new day was finally dawning. The Canaanite army, which had once inspired terror, now lay in ruins, defeated both on the battlefield and by the death of its feared leader. Deborah and Barak, aware of the importance of this moment, called a great assembly of Israel to celebrate the victory. The people, who had lived under the oppression of the Canaanites for so many years, now gathered with hearts full of gratitude and joy. The victory was not just a military one, it was a rebirth for Israel, a new chance to live in freedom and peace. As the Israelites gathered, Deborah climbed to a high place where everyone could see and hear her. She was surrounded by an aura of authority and serenity, and when she began to speak, her voice was strong and clear, reaching every person present. "Hear, O kings! Give ear, O princes! Even I, will sing to the Lord, I will sing praises to the Lord, the God of Israel." Her words, full of praise and gratitude, echoed through the valley, and the crowd responded with a unanimous acclaim. It was a song of victory, a hymn that told not only the story of the battle but also the story of God's faith and faithfulness. Deborah sang of Barak's leadership, of the courage of the 10,000 men of Naphtali and Zebulun who answered the call, and of the incredible divine intervention that turned the battle in Israel's favor. She did not fail to mention Jael, the courageous woman who completed the victory by killing Sisera. "Blessed among women is Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite, blessed among women who dwell in tents." Deborah's song was more than a celebration, it was a reminder that Israel's victory was not the work of human hands alone, but of God, who used unexpected instruments to accomplish His purposes. Throughout the song, Deborah extolled the power of the Lord and encouraged the people to never forget the source of their strength and deliverance. As she sang, the people of Israel began to join in a great wave of praise, accompanying Deborah with their own voices and instruments. It was an unprecedented celebration, a collective expression of relief, joy, and spiritual renewal. Barak, for his part, felt honored but also humbled by what he was witnessing. He knew that without Deborah's guidance and divine intervention, the battle could have ended very differently. He approached Deborah, and together, as Israel's spiritual and military leaders, they led the people in a great offering of sacrifices and thanksgiving to the Lord. With Sisera's defeat, King Jabin's hold on Israel was finally broken. Without their most powerful commander, Jabin's kingdom began to crumble, and the Israelites quickly retook the cities and lands that had been taken from them. The 20-year oppression was over, and Israel now enjoyed a time of peace and prosperity. The story of Israel's victory was told and retold for generations, every detail remembered with reverence and gratitude. Deborah's words, recorded in song, became part of Israel's spiritual heritage, a testament to God's faithfulness and the importance of just and courageous leadership. Deborah continued to serve as a judge and prophetess in Israel, setting an example of wisdom and justice for the people. Under her leadership, Israel experienced 40 years of peace, a time during which the nation was able to rebuild and prosper, free from the yoke of foreign oppression. Jael, who had played a crucial role in the defeat of Sisera, was honored as a heroine among the women of Israel. Their courage was celebrated, and their story was told alongside the great stories of faith and bravery of God's people. As the sun set over the now silent and empty battlefield, Deborah and Barak knew that Israel's struggle was not over forever. There would be other challenges, other battles to be fought. But for now, they rejoiced in the victory the Lord had given them, certain that as long as Israel remained faithful, God would continue to fight for them. The years passed quickly in Israel, and the nation prospered under Deborah's wise leadership. The fields flourished, the cities expanded, and the people, freed from the oppression of the Canaanites, lived in peace and security. But as time passed, the legacy of Deborah and Jael grew ever deeper, permeating the collective memory of Israel. Deborah continued to judge Israel from beneath her palm tree, a symbol of stability and justice. Her name had become synonymous with wisdom and strength. People from all tribes came to her for advice, to settle disputes, or simply to hear her words of guidance. Her presence brought comfort and security to the people, for they knew that as long as Deborah was in charge, justice would prevail in Israel. Deborah was also known for her ability to unite the tribes, which were often divided by internal conflict. She understood that Israel's strength lay in its unity, and she worked tirelessly to keep the people united in the fear of God. Her words of faith and her actions inspired not only her generation, but also future generations, who saw in Deborah an example of divine and human leadership. As Deborah guided Israel with her wisdom, Jael's story also spread throughout the land. Her courage in facing and defeating Sisera made her a figure of respect and admiration. Women of all ages looked to Jael as a model of bravery, someone who had contributed with her own hands to the liberation of Israel. Jael, who had previously lived a quiet and anonymous life, was now seen as a heroine, and her story was told in songs and stories throughout the land. She did not seek fame or glory, but humbly accepted the role God had given her in the great history of Israel. Her simple life, marked by an act of extreme courage, showed the people that God can use anyone, regardless of their background or position, to accomplish His purposes. The legacy of Deborah and Jael extended beyond their lifetimes, inspiring generations of women and men to serve with courage and faithfulness. Deborah's prophecy, that the honor of defeating Sisera would go to a woman, became a constant reminder that God can work in unexpected ways and that the power of faith and righteous action knows no bounds. The stories of Deborah and Jael were passed down from generation to generation. In each telling, in each song, the people of Israel found strength and inspiration. Children grew up hearing about Deborah's wisdom and Jael's courage, learning from an early age about the power of faith and the importance of standing up against injustice. Deborah, in particular, became an archetype of leadership for women in Israel. She showed that women could be leaders, prophets, and spiritual warriors, breaking the cultural expectations of her time. Deborah was not only a judge but also a mother to Israel, guiding and nurturing the nation with her wisdom and faith. The peace that Deborah brought to Israel lasted for 40 years, a period of rest that allowed the people to rebuild after years of oppression. During this time, Israel experienced spiritual renewal, turning to God with gratitude and faithfulness. Deborah remained a central figure in this renewal, constantly reminding the people that their freedom and prosperity were gifts from God to be jealously guarded. When Deborah finally rested from her duties and passed on to the Lord, Israel mourned her loss deeply. Her death was felt as the departure of a great matriarch, whose influence and legacy would forever be inscribed in the history of Israel. Her tomb, marked by a single stone, became a place of reverence, where many came to pay homage to the one who had led Israel through one of its most critical moments. Jael was also remembered and honored by the people. Her story, though less visible than that of Deborah, was told with great respect, and she was celebrated as a woman who, in a time of need, stood up with courage and changed the course of history. Her life after that fateful event was peaceful, and she lived to see Israel enjoy the fruits of the freedom for which she had fought. The legacy of Deborah and Jael was not forgotten as the years passed. Their stories continued to inspire the people of Israel for generations, especially in times of difficulty. When the nation faced new challenges, the memories of these extraordinary women reminded the people that faith in God and courage in the face of the enemy were Israel's greatest weapons. Thus, the story of Deborah and Jael, which began with a call to battle, ended with lasting peace and a spiritual legacy that would endure forever. Israel, guided by the hand of God and the actions of courageous women, found its redemption and peace. After Deborah's death, Israel faced a period of transition. The lasting peace she had helped establish offered the people the opportunity to rebuild and prosper, but it also brought new challenges to the new generation growing up in the shadow of her legacy. This generation had not known the horrors of Canaanite oppression or the battles that had liberated Israel. They inherited peace, but they also inherited the duty to maintain it. Mount Tabor, once the site of the fierce battle that had defined Israel's course, was now a place of gathering and celebration. Parents took their children to the mountain, telling them stories of the courageous deeds of Barak, Deborah, and Jael. These tales were received with awe and sometimes a little incredulity. To many young people, the stories seemed like distant legends, heroisms that were hard to imagine in times of peace. In these calm days, Israel's leaders faced the challenge of teaching a generation that had no direct memory of past hardships and triumphs. The goal was to instill in the youth a sense of responsibility and a continuing commitment to the values that had guided their ancestors. The importance of faith, justice, and courage needed to be a living reality for them, not just stories from the past. Among the youth of Israel, a remarkable figure emerged, a young woman named Miriam. Inspired by the stories of Deborah, Miriam felt a deep calling to leadership. She would spend hours under the same palm tree where Deborah had judged Israel, reflecting on the role she could play in guiding her people. Miriam was endowed with a wisdom reminiscent of Deborah, and many began to seek her advice and resolve conflicts. Like Deborah, Miriam felt her mission was to maintain unity among the tribes of Israel. She worked to resolve disputes and promote peace, always emphasizing the importance of returning to the scriptures and traditions of their ancestors. Miriam knew that forgetting history could lead to complacency, something that could jeopardize Israel's stability. In this new period of peace, Israel also saw a cultural renaissance. Artists, musicians, and poets flourished, many of them inspired by stories of courage and faith. The Song of Deborah, in particular, became a frequent hymn at festivals and religious gatherings, a constant reminder of the power of faith and divine intervention in Israel's history. Meanwhile, Jael's family, especially her daughter, Tamar, continued to be revered in Israel. Inspired by her mother's courage, Tamar dedicated herself to teaching the young women of Israel the skills of self-defense and the importance of being prepared to protect their families and their land. Tamar's workshops were well attended, and many young women emerged not only with new skills but also with a renewed sense of purpose and self-confidence. As the years passed, Israel's younger generation began to embrace their role in continuing the story of their people. They learned from the past, but they also looked to the future, seeking ways to apply the principles of faith, courage, and justice in their own lives. The peace that Deborah and Jael had helped to bring about was seen not only as a gift, but as a foundation upon which they could build an even brighter future. Miriam and Tamar, each in their own way, became symbols of this new generation that not only inherited peace but also took on the responsibility of preserving and enriching it. They were living proof that the legacy of Deborah and Jael continued to inspire and shape Israel, ensuring that the lessons of the past were not forgotten but honored and perpetuated. Despite the peace and prosperity that reigned in Israel, tranquility did not remain unshaken. Over time, new challenges arose, testing the resilience and faith of the new generation. Internal conflicts, disputes over land and resources, and the constant threat from neighboring nations began to disrupt the stability that Israel had enjoyed. Miriam, now recognized as a spiritual and administrative leader among her people, faced these challenges with a wisdom that many compared to that of Deborah. She strove to mediate disputes, seeking fair solutions that honored Israel's tradition and law. However, she knew that a lasting solution to these problems required more than temporary compromises. It required a renewed commitment to the values and faith that had united Israel under Deborah and Barak. Tensions grew when a severe drought struck the land, exacerbating disputes over water and fertile land. Tribes began to turn against each other, and the unity of Israel was at risk. Miriam, deeply concerned about the direction things were taking, called an assembly of leaders from all the tribes to Mount Tabor, the very spot where Deborah had led Israel to victory many years earlier. There, she reminded everyone of the legacy of courage, faith, and unity that had been Israel's strength in the past. Do you remember how our ancestors united under Deborah and Barak to defeat Sisera? How God provided for us not only victory but lasting peace. We are the heirs of that faith and courage. We must not allow momentary disputes to divide or weaken us. Inspired by Miriam's speech, the leaders agreed to seek joint solutions to the problems. They formed a council to manage the distribution of resources and mediate conflicts, ensuring that no tribe would be disadvantaged. This council would also work to revitalize the practice and teaching of the laws and traditions that had governed Israel since the days of Moses. At the same time, Tamar, following the example of her mother Jael, organized groups of young people to help in the areas most affected by the drought. These young people worked not only to bring material relief, but also to strengthen community bonds, teaching that solidarity was essential to Israel's survival and prosperity. These joint actions brought a new wave of unity and strength to Israel. The crisis, while challenging, ultimately served as a catalyst for a renewal of community spirit and faith. The assembly on Mount Tabor became an annual event, a time to renew Israel's covenant with God and among its tribes. As the years passed, the new generation of Israel learned to value more deeply the legacy of their ancestors. They understood that challenges were opportunities to reaffirm their identity and commitments. The story of Deborah and Jael, along with the leadership of Miriam and Tamar, became a constant reminder that with faith and unity, no challenge was too great to overcome. Israel, strengthened by these trials, continued to grow, not only in wealth and power, but in wisdom and grace. The people recognized that a nation's true strength lay not merely in its wealth or weapons, but in the ability of its citizens to live together in peace and justice, guided by the principles that Deborah and Jael had exemplified. As the sun set over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, Miriam gazed at Israel's future from atop Mount Tabor. She reflected on the challenges she had faced and the victories she had achieved, knowing that her current peace and prosperity were the fruits of great faith and hard work. The legacy of Deborah and Jael, the wisdom passed down through the generations, had shaped Israel into a strong and united nation. But Miriam knew that the future would bring new challenges. Peace was never guaranteed forever, and each generation would need to reaffirm its commitment to the values that had kept Israel united and strong. She pondered how she could ensure that future generations would continue to value and practice these principles. Determined to further strengthen Israel's ties to its history and faith, Miriam began a project to record the laws, stories, and songs that had guided Israel through the centuries. She summoned scribes and wise men from all the tribes, commissioning them to create a compendium of teachings that would serve as a guide for the people. This compendium would include the Song of Deborah, the stories of Jael's courage, and many other narratives of faith and leadership that had sustained Israel. Miriam also included sections on the divine laws given to Moses, interpreted in light of the people's experiences since then. The goal was to create a living document that would not only preserve the past but also guide Israel in the present and future. As this project progressed, Tamar continued to lead efforts to strengthen Israel's most vulnerable communities. Inspired by her mother's resilience and courage, she organized training programs for young people, teaching them not only practical skills but also the importance of community service and ethical leadership. The new generation of Israel, raised under the guidance of Miriam and Tamar, grew up with a strong sense of their heritage and responsibilities. They understood that Israel's true strength lay not only in its military prowess or economic wealth, but in its faithfulness to God and its ability to live according to principles of justice and compassion. As the compendium was completed and distributed throughout the land, it became a cornerstone in the education and spiritual life of the people of Israel. Each year, during the celebrations on Mount Tabor, new additions were made to the document, reflecting the lessons learned and the stories experienced throughout the year. Israel prospered, and its influence grew in the region. Leaders of other nations came to Israel for wisdom and fellowship, recognizing the uniqueness of a nation that had not only survived countless challenges but thrived through its faithfulness to divine principles. Miriam, in her later years, looked to the future with hope. She knew that struggles would continue, but she also knew that the foundations that had been laid were strong. Faith in God, dedication to justice, and courage in the face of adversity were now indelible features of Israel's character. As the sunset completed its colorful spectacle, Miriam prayed, thanking God for guidance and strength. She asked for wisdom for future generations, that they might continue Israel's story with the same faith and courage that Deborah and Jael had shown. And so, under the darkening sky, peace reigned in Israel, a peace forged by steadfast commitment to the highest ideals.